Insights on the latest developments, we're joined by Dr. Courtney Freer, Assistant Professor of Middle East Studies at Emory University and a Senior Fellow at the Gulf International Forum, live from Atlanta, Georgia. Thank you so much for being with us here today. Dr. Freer, President Trump has threatened a major strike on Iran's suspected underground nuclear facility near Natanz, while Tehran has warned that any such attack would dramatically expand the conflict. How serious is this latest escalation, and what risks does it pose for the region?
Yeah, good morning. Thanks for having me. I think this is a major risk in terms of making the war potentially spiral out of control. So I think there are kind of three risks that we could see knocking on from a potential new attack on Natanz. First would be continued threats to civilians. I think we've seen over the past week even attacks on civilian infrastructure in the Gulf, in Kuwait specifically, and also attacks to civilian infrastructure in Iran have happened over the course of the war. The more that these types of attacks happen, the harder it is to bring people to the table, the harder it makes negotiations to happen. So that's kind of the second effect that such escalation could have, that it's more difficult to get parties to come to the table if they think that they can make strategic advances on the military, on the battlefield, essentially. And then I think the third kind of risk that could come from this is a potential spread to other actors in the region getting involved in the war. If this US attack happens, will this lead to other Iranian-linked actors getting more involved in the war? For instance, we've seen the Houthis just this week have said that they will block Saudi shipping through the Bab el-Mandab Strait. So we could see this broadening out of the conflict if we see a resort back to using the battlefield to get gains rather than using diplomacy to do that.
Well, Courtney, the Secretary of State Marco Rubio says the US still remains open to negotiations, yet military operations continue for an 11th consecutive night. Do you see Washington pursuing a dual strategy of military pressure and diplomacy, and is that approach likely to succeed?
It's a good question. I mean, and I think the White House's and the State Department's messaging on this has been a little bit confusing, frankly. I mean, Rubio has said that Iranian behavior has to change before American behavior will change, and that the US essentially will come to the table when it perceives that the Iranian side is serious, whatever that means, in terms of coming to negotiations. And so essentially, Trump has made these similar statements that Iran has to prove that it is serious about negotiating. Whether that is about the Strait of Hormuz, whether that is about a nuclear agreement, it's unclear. But essentially, they've put the onus on Iran. They've said that we will come to the table if Iran will come to the table as well. Right now, I mean, given that we're in the 11th day straight of these continued strikes, given the rhetoric that we're seeing about an attack on Natanz, it seems that the administration is trying to weaken Iran militarily to bring it to the table potentially. But I think it's kind of too early to see in terms of how that diplomacy will happen. What would be the shift that would then allow these parties to come to the table?
And Iran says that reopening the Strait of Hormuz was a central objective of the Islamabad memorandum, while the United States insists it's protecting freedom of navigation. How critical has the Strait of Hormuz become to the wider geopolitical confrontation?
I think it's become quite critical. We hear a lot of talk about the Strait of Hormuz. I would say sitting in the United States, one major effect, the major effect that most Americans feel from the war is rise in oil prices. Why? Because of the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. So I think it is central. I mean, the Trump administration is framing the closure of the Strait of Hormuz as a broader issue about freedom of navigation and is saying that it does not want to set a precedent through which any state can control an international waterway. And so is using the Strait of Hormuz kind of as a broader signaling as to how they think freedom of navigation should be maintained. I think if we look at the previous MOU that was in place, the Strait of Hormuz was critical to that, but there were different interpretations in terms of what freedom of navigation would look like through the Strait of Hormuz. So if Iran perceived that the MOU allowed it to determine which route ships could use through the Strait of Hormuz, and if they did not do that, then they could invoke a toll, then they could attack these ships, things like this. And so I think it has become a critical juncture in terms of what type of agreement will emerge moving forward. How do you get both parties to agree on what freedom of navigation means when it comes to the Strait of Hormuz specifically? Does that allow Iran to exact an economic cost, for instance, for ships moving through the strait? The U.S. has said no. Gulf states have also said that they would reject any type of agreement like that. So I do think it's become very central in terms of not just the geopolitics, but also global economics.
Pakistan has stepped up mediation efforts with the Iranian Interior Minister Alexander Momeni meeting the Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif and expected talks with Pakistan's military leadership. Can regional mediators like Pakistan play a meaningful role in reviving this diplomacy?
I think they definitely can, and I think one of the things that makes a good mediator is that a mediator has contact with both sides, and we know that Pakistan has that. Qatar has also been in contact with both sides, and Pakistan has asserted itself and has said that it is willing to play this role, essentially. Just today, Pakistan has asked the U.S. for a $10 billion exchange stabilization facility that would shore up its liquidity. We'll see kind of if the U.S. will accept that and will, kind of how much does the U.S. value Pakistani mediation when it comes to a monetary figure is unclear. But I do think that it's a good sign that if you're going to mediate, you have to have open dialogue with both sides. You have to have both sides trust that mediator. I think the fact that Pakistan was central to the previous MOU is a good sign in terms of both parties being able to trust that Pakistan will hear them out and will take their opinions and their needs into consideration moving forward with whatever type of hopefully longer term agreement that can be reached.
And finally, the Pentagon says the conflict has already cost the US more than $37 billion. From both a strategic and an economic perspective, how sustainable is a prolonged confrontation with Iran, and what could be the broader consequences for the Gulf region and global energy markets?
Great question. I mean, when it comes to the economic side of this, I mean, we'll see whether Congress will approve this funding. I believe that Hegseth asked for an additional $87 billion, 67 billion of which would go towards operations for the Middle East. So this is a staggering amount of money. It would likely greatly exacerbate the U.S. federal deficit. It would bring American military spending to an all-time high in the modern era. And so Hegseth has framed this as an urgent need to ensure that service members are paid, to ensure that training can happen, things like this. And so that's how it strategically. Economically, I think it may be difficult to justify. I think another thing that makes this especially difficult is the timing. We have the midterm elections for Congress that are happening here in November. And so I could see a lot of members of Congress either wanting to support or not to support this increase in funding from a strategic, kind of electoral perspective. In terms of strategy, I think one thing that became clear from the questions that were asked in Congress yesterday is that a lot of Americans are unsure about how this funding would translate into strategic gains on the ground. They're unclear what are the goals of this American military action. Is it regime change? Is it removing the ability of Iran to have a nuclear weapon? Is it freedom of navigation through the Strait of Hormuz? And so I think absent real kind of answers to those questions, it's unclear what the strategic gain would be of that increase in funding. There's concern, I think, about this kind of signaling an expansion of operations, potentially a ground invasion. We're not sure whether that will happen at this point, but it's worth pointing out that 68% of Americans have said that have kind of said in public opinion polls that the war is not worth fighting. And so I think American lawmakers are acutely aware of that, especially in a midterm election year. So they may be strategic in terms of how they decide to vote on in Congress about that increase in funding. But again, I think that on the side of the White House, the Pentagon, the Department of State, I think it's unclear how this increase in funding would be translated into strategic military and geopolitical gains. I mean, if the war continues, as I said before, I think it will be more difficult to bring people to the negotiating table as more and more destruction happens. And also we do have the issue of freedom of navigation as well, rising oil prices, global economic knock-on effects of the continued war. So I guess we will see what happens. We'll see whether that request for funding is approved in the U.S. and what that means strategically. What does an expansion look like for U.S. operations in this war?
Dr. Courtney, thank you so much. Appreciate it.